hello, hello, hello. Welcome back. How are you doing? Woohoo! There's two in the middle who are like, loving it! Climate action! Welcome to 10 years of the Paris Agreement, from ambition to action. In this session, we're going to be looking at the Paris Agreement 10 years on. It was a landmark it was a landmark in climate diplomacy. And since then, we've seen progress, we've seen delays, we've seen momentum, and we've also seen a little bit of resistance. But that hasn't stopped the great work that people have been doing. So this session is focusing on what's happening right now. What is the science saying? What is civil society doing to shape the response? And how is business, finance, and public institutions acting? So to kick us off for this session, we're going to begin by having a look at the science. A global picture of where we are now since the Paris Agreement, what's changed, and of course, what hasn't changed, and how that frames the decisions that we're going to make going forward. So to introduce us for this first session, we have a keynote from the Vice Chair of the IPCC. Please welcome to the stage Diana Egger-Vorstads.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's an absolute honor to be here, to be addressing you about 10 years of the Paris Agreement, where we are, from the perspective of the science. Because you are the ones who are actually going to make the difference. So let's see where we are. Well, I know that you've been expecting some of this bad news at the beginning of my talk. Yes, these are what you see on the last bar of this figure is showing that, that 2024 was the warmest year in Europe, and it was even the increase as compared to the previous year was too large that nobody really expected. It was especially surprising because that year was the end of the El Nino, and in fact, it was starting of a La Nina, which should have actually cooled Europe and the climate. Not only that, but there are many other indicators where we see many records broken. For example, carbon dioxide concentrations have increased more than ever before. And I don't know why my slides are not changing. I'm sorry. Yeah, here they are. So as you see, not only they have increased a lot, but it was a record global increase in carbon dioxide concentrations. So what does the science say? What can we still do? And how can we meet the Paris Agreement's goals? This cartoon shows what we are doing. This is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, who we assess the science and present its findings for decision makers in our so-called assessment reports roughly every 7 years. And we have so far done it 6 times. So let me share with you some of the findings of our 6th assessment from different reports. So first of all, the figures that you have seen show that global average temperatures has not been so high at least for 125,000 years. So literally, in a generation, in my lifetime, we have returned the geological clock of the planet by 125,000 years. In fact, if we look at carbon dioxide concentrations that I also shown, we have returned the geological clock of the Earth by 2 million years. If we look at methane or nitrous oxide, this is 800,000 years. So, but we have been taking action. And it is exactly this very city where history was made 10 years ago through the Paris Agreement. And when the Paris Agreement was concluded at COP21, the government also asked the IPCC to look at how 1.5 degrees global warming, capping global warming at 1.5 degrees is possible. Because in fact, that was not only historic by the significance of the agreement, but in fact, the Paris Agreement made history also by the fact that that was one of the few times when politics ran far ahead of science. Before the agreement, if a scientist talked about 1.5 degrees, he was considered, you know, a tree hugger. You probably wouldn't get a grant. You were easily dismissed. So we didn't have the science yet. So the government asked IPCC to prepare such a report. So I was here as a young, just freshly elected bureau member of the IPCC, and we were talking about my colleagues, and many of my colleagues said, no, we have to tell governments that we shouldn't do this. This train is gone. This train has left the station. It's impossible to do 1.5 degrees anymore. In the end, we didn't tell governments, and in the end, we did start writing the report. And just a few weeks later, more and more of my colleagues were desperately, and in fact very enthusiastically, were very busy to run their models to see, well, can we still make 1.5 degrees? How can we do it? And in fact, what we found is, let me highlight a couple of the findings. This was the report that came out in 2018, and it made bigger news than any other climate report or climate event ever in history, and ever since then as well. So what you see here is that we've proved that actually there's not only one way to get to 1.5 degrees at that time in 2018. But in fact, all these lines that you see in that cloud, which are the many, many gray lines, all of those roads actually lead to Rome. So there are many different techno-economic opportunities and pathways and different choices for us to still keep global warming at 1.5 degrees. However, there were only a couple of common things among them. So what you see is that most of these lines actually cross the zero line, which is that faint little gray line, at about 2050, and they have the emissions at about 2030. So the important thing to understand that the IPCC never says what has to be done. We never said that the world has to do net zero by the middle of the century. All we did actually was this figure, where it was a very faint zero line, which was crossing at mid-century. And just after this figure, without really emphasizing net zero, just 3 years after the publication of our report, already almost 90% of global emissions were covered by around mid-century net zero commitments by governments. If you don't call it history, then I don't know what we call it. Especially that even the concept of net zero was equally considered a utopia or a tree hugger craziness before the Paris Agreement. So not only has it become mainstream, but it was internalized by most of the key governments of the planet. So I do think we need to recognize this and celebrate this, because usually we only talk about the bad news, how far we are from our goals. But I also do want to show the other side of the coin, that yes, we are still very far from our goals, but in fact, we have already come very far. And yes, you can, and there are also not only countries, but also cities have made commitments. At least 826 cities and 103 regions committed to have zero emission targets. And also many of the corporate sector, many of you who are sitting here represent probably efforts to meet such targets. Okay, of course you can say that it's easy to set a target for 2050, right? Especially if you're a bit in the age and you won't live that long, or you definitely won't be in office, so you won't be responsible for actually implementing that promise. Nevertheless, a lot has actually been done towards that goal. So one of the areas where we have seen enormous progress in the last 10 years, again progress that nobody, not even the International Energy Agency also in Paris, and no other think tank have actually managed to project, was the really unexpectedly important development in the price of renewable energy. What you see in this figure from the IPCC report, that the market cost of these different renewable energy options, as well as battery packs for electric vehicles, have dropped dramatically, by some of them by over 99% in just a matter of 2 decades. And when the lines cross the yellow area, that means that their cost is now competitive with fossil fuels. In fact, you see some of these lines actually going below that, meaning that, for example, photovoltaic energy is now the cheapest source of energy almost on all of the planet in many cases. And as a result, we do see a very remarkable uptake of these technologies, as you can see in this figure. And we see that also in the results. For example, this is the European Union. And on the right-hand side, you see that last year, 46% of European power was generated through renewables. And out of that, from that, 30% of the total was just wind and solar. So just these two forms of energy now produce more of our power in the European Union than fossil fuels. And that's what has happened last year. So yes, we have been definitely breaking a lot of milestones, and this is also happening worldwide. Last year, 92.5% of all power capacity expansions were for renewable energy. So yes, ladies, and this is up from a fraction of this just a decade ago. So yes, ladies and gentlemen, we have come very far. And this is from my country, Hungary. So we, just as an example, we have increased our solar energy generation in 5 years by 6-fold. And by today, we are producing more than 1/5 of all of our power from solar energy. And that was not necessary from major climate commitments. That's just common sense and business interest and energy security and other interests. And also, the world is set to add over 5,500 gigawatts of new renewable capacity between now and 2030. So we are forecasted to end, by the end of this decade, more renewable capacity that has already been added in the past 2 decades. So these are really very remarkable results. But let me go also just on one other area of the outstanding results. And I'm sure you could, since you are the ones who are making these results, you are the ones who are catalyzing this change. You are the movers and shakers. I'm sure you have many other such stories, and outside this room or later within this room, you are going to share those. So let me just share one other, because we are in that city. Cities have been also making tremendous progress. And for example, we know that Paris has been one of the champions in making their city less car-friendly and less designed for cars, metal boxes, and more for people. So, for example, now Paris has over 1,000 kilometers of bicycle lanes. And as a result, half of the inner city trips are actually made by walking, because it's also a very walkable city. 30% of the trips made by public transport. 14% now by bicycle, up from 2% just before the Paris Agreement. And only 11% by car. So that means the car is now almost represents one of the smallest shares of mobility in Paris. And as a result, not only carbon dioxide emissions have been going down. But as you can see, also other air pollution. So what is illustrated in this figure is that literally since the Paris Agreement, air pollution has been reduced very significantly in this city. So if you make change, you will make change not only in one area, but in many areas. But of course, it's not all a rosy picture. We know that very well. But it is important to partially celebrate where we have come. But we are still very far. Because as you can see, even if we implement all the policies that we have today, our emissions are not likely to go down. They are likely just to stagnate over the century. And as you see, the red lines, the red range is very far from either the 1.5 or 2 degree compatible futures. So yes, it is very far. Nevertheless, please do remember the shape of these lines because I will come back to them. So you don't have to read all the different numbers and all the different complexities in this figure. We scientists are very good at giving you a lot of uncertainty and complexity. But in summary, let me summarize the essence of this figure. What this shows that depending on how the world is progressing and our policies are progressing, anywhere we are between 1.7 and 3.6 degrees is where we are going to be towards the end of this century, depending on different scientific things. But even it is very true that this is still 1 to 2 degrees warmer than where we want to be and where the Paris Agreement asked us to be. It does need to be celebrated that it is already much less than it was supposed to be when we concluded the Paris Agreement. So these are the projections, the temperature projections of the 6th assessment report that we started when the Paris Agreement was concluded. This is from that literature. And what you see here is that basically with the policies that we have implemented since the Paris Agreement, we have made the top 2 lines impossible to happen, basically, unless there is something we don't understand on climate science. But it's very likely that we will not go to the dark red and the red lines. And we very rarely say that we have already shaved at around 2 degrees off of the worst case scenario of the climate. So it is quite an important achievement. Because yes, if you look, it doesn't go back. Yes, it goes back. So if you look at, if you remember the lines that I've showed as our projections, it is not, so the top 2 is way above there. Yes, it is not either along the orange or the blues where we should be, but it has come down very significantly just within 1 decade. Okay. But why is that despite all these efforts, despite all this amazing news that we have outperformed any expectations on renewable energy, we have outperformed many cities have been leading the world or leading the way in making much more livable cities, much more competitive and productive cities, and while also cleaning up emissions. Why is that still emissions are increasing instead of going down? So I think one of the answers is really in this picture. Yes, we have been great. We have been really great at promoting active mobility, promoting public transport. We have at renewable energy, in many things. But at the same time, all of those uses where we have not yet made a difference are only getting bigger and bigger and bigger. For example, cars. Yes, we may be running a lot more electric cars. We may be are much better at efficiency. But if all of these gains are eaten up by the increasing size of automobiles and the increasing number of automobiles, that is not going to help overall. So then that's exactly the same phenomena in the power sector as well. What you see here is that, yes, the green line, we have been great at increasing the green share of energy production, and here this is about electricity. But our hunger for more energy has been growing more than how much we have been able to upscale all the renewable energy and clean energy options. So what does that mean? What that means is, in order to win this, what the agenda for you, the change makers, is we also need to focus not only on the supply side, but also on the demand side. We have to do more well-being, more productivity, more economic growth with less. We do need to reduce energy and material demand while increasing well-being, because this part of the equation is rarely thought about. But this, we need to put equal attention to this, not only on producing more clean energy and more materials. Fortunately, our 6th assessment report, the Working Group 3 report, has put a lot of effort in this and brought a lot of knowledge to you on this matter, because we have a whole chapter on demand and services, which talks a lot about how you can achieve better quality of life, how you can measure happiness and progress in other ways than GDP, how you can have much more livable cities with less emissions, less materials, but actually, how can you do more? So what this figure illustrates is, yes, demand chapter and services chapter comes first. So before you do anything, it's a good idea to ask, can I actually do what I want to do with less energy and less materials? And only once you have reduced that and see, no, I really need this amount of materials or energy for what I need to do or want to do, then come to the decarbonization part in all the different sectors. If we take that as a priority in the next decade of the Paris Agreement, I hope that we will be much better at also bending the curve for the emissions. And if we meet in another 10 years, we will be able to celebrate even more. But I do think we do have the reason to celebrate and use that celebration and use that to actually even be more bold and produce more of the impossible. Because, as I said, when we started our report, we thought 1.5 was impossible. Now it is probably impossible, but every fraction of a degree matters. Even if we surpass 1.5, it's a big difference whether we surpass it by only 0.1 degree or much more and can stop warming there. So we need your boldness in action equally, exactly as much as 10 years ago. Thank you very much for the attention.
Thank you so much, Diana. Thank you, Diana. So we've just heard about how far we've come since the Paris Agreement. So now let's turn ourselves to look forward. So 10 years post the agreement, the issue is not ambition. We've worked that out. The issue is who is challenging. The issue is a challenge of delivery. How are we actually driving this change forward? And so in this next conversation we're about to have, it's all about the voices that sit outside the system and how they connect or collide with institutions. I have two brilliant voices who are going to be joining me for this dialogue to explore how do we move faster. First, please welcome to the stage my two guests, Chief Creative Officer from the UNPD, Boaz Paladi, and a member of the UN Secretary General's Youth Advisory Group on Climate Change, Nisreen El-Siam. Hello, hello.
Hi.
Diana, are you rejoining us as well?
We like her, so we keep her.
Okie doke. So it's been 10 years since the Paris Agreement, and we're here looking at the legacy of the Paris Agreement. And looking back on that moment, what have we learned? Boaz, maybe you can start. What are the key things that you think we've learned post-Paris Agreement?
So to me, what we've learned is what's happening here. If you look behind us, that's where the transition is happening. That's where the hope is. That's where the opportunity is. That's what we've learned. We've learned, like Diana just said in her keynote, that there's a glass half full here. Although kind of like we're far behind, and although kind of like the reports are a bit scary, there's still an opportunity for us to really create the tomorrow that we want. And I think that's the lesson that the most important lesson that we've learned in the last 10 years.
The opportunity is absolutely still there. Nazreen, what do you think the biggest learning that we've had is?
I think Paris Agreement was, as I call it always, a mega social experiment, because it was more of a voluntary nature. It was more built on the goodwill of the countries. And as far as we are right now, we are not there. So I can't say that the experiment totally failed, but we learned very good lessons from it. One, I think that reducing emissions is a must, yet it's not happening enough. Two, removing emissions that we already have is also a must, and yet we are very far from having enough studies on the mechanisms of carbon removal. The scientific support for carbon is also way far behind, and I think now the world is going very much into experimenting and learning more and reading more, and it should be supported more research about carbon removals and different climate contingency processes. And I think the third one will be repair, because our system needs a repair, and now nature-based solutions is going quite well, but it's still not there also. And the last one is resilience, and I think that this is the biggest outcome from Paris, that we need the four together: the reduce, the remove, the repair, and the resilience. Otherwise, we cannot move forward. It's like a four pillars building for sustainability and for climate action.
I love those four really clear, distinct pillars. People know the climate story. I mean, we're here at Change now. The story around where we are with climate isn't something that's new to the people in the room. But what people are sometimes unsure of is, what should my role be within this climate story? So what turns people from understanding the urgency to being in a place of agency around climate, especially for a public who right now are feeling potentially quite overwhelmed by the amount of things that are flying at us? How do we turn that urgency into momentum and agency? Nazreen, do you mind starting?
I think this is a very funny question, because I always get in the middle of a fight. It's a fight between consumers and producers. Consumers say, if the producers didn't make this thing, I will not use it. And the producer says, we don't make things out of the blue. We really depend on the demand. So if there's no demands from the users or consumers, then we will not produce, really. And I think it's definitely both. Consumers have to be the agents by stop consuming and using the things that we know that hurt the planet. But also, let's face it, it's not the consumers that make the most impact and the most emissions. It's actually the producers. And most of the time is not the final outcome and production that actually make the most emission. It's the process to make the final outcome that makes the most emissions. So yes, we all have to really have more sustainable living world and living systems, but also, let's face it, I mean, all of us in this room and maybe all of us in this continent are still less than how much US Army is producing out of carbon emissions. In fact, Africa as a continent, which one of the continents that have one of the biggest populations, have only 1% of the emissions. So even all of the African people went zero like really minus, let's say minus carbon emissions, they will still have global warming, a very bad one also. So yeah, it's have to be both. Both have to be agents, both consumers and producers, and let's point more on the producers and say, hey, you're not doing enough. And even if we stop using your materials or your outcomes, it's the process to make it that produce more emissions.
We touched on consumerism and overconsumption in the panel before, so I love that you brought it up here as well. Boaz, from your perspective, what do you think is needed to transmute this urgency into actual agency? Because for some people, there's a sense of helplessness.
I think there is. I think the climate emergency is daunting. It's a big problem. One has difficulty in seeing oneself in it. How can I, as a small individual, have impact on a planet? So what we have to do is create. We should basically what we need to do is create agents of change, and we need as many agents of change as possible. We have about 8 billion of them. You know, let's get everyone on board. We need to convince everyone around the world that they are all agents of change, that we all can make a difference. And so, of course, kind of like, you know, everyone is right when they say that, you know, consumers themselves are not the biggest part of the problem and are not the solution. Energy use is probably the biggest part of it. But if we all take action, if we all are part of a global community that really kind of like looks at how we can make a difference, how each of us can make a difference, that will eventually make a difference. The other thing is that, you know, when people become agents of change and, you know, they're big CEOs of a company, they can take that agents of change into that big company. It's all kind of like a matter of people creating change. And I believe that to do that, we need to get everyone on board.
We've been talking a lot about getting everybody on board. We've been talking about implementation. We've been talking about collaboration. What do you think helps build collaboration between those inside these institutions that are needed to create the frameworks to support the collaboration, and those from the outside that are pushing this collaboration? Boaz, how do we really actually do collaboration?
I think, you know, the Paris Agreement is a perfect example of that. I mean, and what we see in the Paris Agreement and how it has moved forward in the last 10 years is significantly different. We see now when you go to COP, you know, when we get to COP Brazil, COP 30, we will see that civil society is a much larger force there, that youth are a much larger force, that business is a much larger force. And so essentially kind of like we've moved so far away from these powers that be deciding to a much more inclusive process that really kind of like has everyone in that picture. And I think that's an incredibly important part of it. It's really moving that process along, but in a way the process is moving itself. In a way the transition is happening, more and more actors are getting involved, more and more businesses are getting involved, and that's what's going to move the needle.
That collaboration. Nazreen, from your perspective?
Yeah, I think this question is quite timely, as all of us maybe are questioning whether we have global governance or not. And with everything happening in the world right now, I can very fairly say that the world global governance is being reshaped. The question is, how is this reshape is going to benefit us, and how can we take it back to our side? Well, first of all, I think we are all now questioning the existing institutions that is implementing everything, including UN, including different governments around the world, governments that we used to think they are leading the world, basically. And I think this reshape of the global governance can be back to our side by basically putting the power in the right hands. And by the right hands, I mean not a few hands, but many hands that can actually lead the things forward. Basically, as we all say, power to the people. But how can we literally give the power to the people? Well, one, I'm very disappointed that people voted again for Trump. But this is the past right now. How can we make the future more brighter? And I think having more young people in the global governance structures and having more climate believers and climate positive people is going to really reshape how we think on the general governance structures. The second thing is, how can we center science? I mean, we all heard Diana right now, and we've been hearing the IPCC for many years. But unfortunately, even for many decades, scientists were never really in the power. They always make reports that end up in the cabinets of whatever parliament or wherever government. But it is really high time to bring young people and women and scientists up to the hierarchy where they are the ones responsible for making the decisions, not people who take us backward, basically.
So we need a different distribution. Yeah, go on, give it a good round of applause. We need a different distribution of power and different voices that are actually around the table having those conversations. We spend a lot of time talking about the problems. We spend a lot of time talking about what's not working. But I'm really excited to hear maybe one or two examples of things where it has been working really effectively. Maybe Boaz, maybe perhaps you can start and give us some examples of right now where that you think more people should know about, where we are collaborating really effectively.
I think there's so many incredible stories around the green transition and where people are and what they're doing. I was just walking through the hall behind us as I was walking in, and it's so inspiring. It's so inspiring that so many people has taken this on as businessmen, as entrepreneurs, as solution providers. And I think those are the stories that need to be highlighted. It's important that we always kind of like try and see where the opportunity lies, where we can find the thing that will make it possible for us to create a better tomorrow. I'm an optimist. I still believe that we can create a better tomorrow. And I think the answer to it partly is what we're seeing here in Change Now, this incredible transition. Partly it's just incredible stories from all over the world that people are doing it. They're part of the transition.
People are part of the transition. Nizarine, do you have an example that you'd like to share with us?
I have many.
Okay, but we've only really got time for like one. So pick your juiciest one.
Okay, so one, I'm really proud of the youth climate movement around the world. They are really going very far in terms of not only the quantity of engagements, because we are far behind talking about youth engagement, but even the quality of it. So now we are talking about meaningful youth engagements. But the one example I want to talk about is basically the network that currently me and a team of people are co-founding, which is basically called Youth Alliance for Local Adaptation and Peace. And it's basically one of the networks that are covering over 27 countries that are very much in trouble in terms of governance, in terms of political situation, in terms of safety and security, but also very vulnerable to climate change. And it's shocking how some countries are doomed by being always less in terms of economy, in terms of climate adaptation, in terms of everything. And it's basically countries where we really fail to look at very meaningfully. And the young people from this country are speaking out and saying, hey, we exist in this planet. We share the same atmosphere with you. We share the same Earth planet with you. It's high time to listen to us. It's time to bring us forward, because we are suffering from both conflicts and wars and climate change.
Wonderful. I love those two examples. And I'm going to wrap on a single word from each of you. Fabius left us with the word implementation in the opening. If there was one word that you'd want everybody here to take away into the rest of Change Now, into the next decade, what would that be? Nizarine, I'll start with you. What would be your one word?
Truth. People should be true to themselves and to the work that they are doing.
Fantastic. And Boaz, what would be the
opportunity?
Word? Oh, I love that. Opportunity, because it keeps us open in a space of hope. Thank you both so much for your time. Please give them both a warm round of applause.
Can we take it?
Got another session immediately after, but I can take one with you afterwards.
It's actually me too.
Sorry?
I'm also
No, I've got another panel immediately now. I'll grab one with you in a bit. So We've heard about change and how that's being pushed from the inside, but we can't forget the role of people. As much as we love the role of people in organizations, we also cannot forget the role of governments, the role of finance, and the role of large companies. So we're going to turn now to a conversation about systems and the systems that hold the power. The business, the finance, the institutions, where the ambition really can meet delivery. What are these people doing? So we're going to talk about what's helping climate action right now and how we move to build ideas that are not just short-term ideas, but long-term ideas of legacy. So for this discussion, please, joining me on the stage, we will have the CEO of Beko Corporate, Hakan Beluga. We'll have a business leader, campaigner, and co-author of Net Positive, Paul Pullman. Co-founder of Change Now, Kevin Tayabali, and Deputy CEO of l'Agence Française de Développement, Marie-Hélène Louison. Please welcome all four of them to the stage.
Hi.
Hello.
Left hand, sorry.
It's okay.
How are you?
Hi, how are you? Hello. Good to see you again.
How are you doing?
Wonderful. Welcome to the stage. Now, aren't we in for a bit of a conversation here? I'm going to start by pretty much jumping straight into it. We're leading through a time of turbulence. There's probably no point pretending that the world is we've had some big changes of late, and we're living through a moment in economic strain, political backsliding, climate urgency. And in this landscape, what helps our leaders, the main leaders, to actually stay the course rather than jump off it? Paul, I'm actually going to start with you on this one.
So I'll give you a very simple answer. I call it the ABCs of leadership right now. The A stands for being adaptive. Understand what is happening in this world, what is changing, why so many governments got voted out of office, what the other 50% is really concerned about. Adaptive leader. Understand what world you live in. Some are a little bit aloof on both sides of the equation. The B stands for bridging. When you get half the population voting for someone else, don't condemn them. Try to understand what makes them tick. What you find is that many of the values are actually the same. They all want their children to do better. They want a better future. They want air they can breathe. Find these common grounds and work with people. I spent a week in Washington to try to understand the other side. It's not easy, but there are many things we can work together. And the C is, in fact, the collaboration. We need to move away from this mindset of competitive leadership to collaborative leadership. Within all of that, don't lose your values, your purpose, keep focused on the long term, build your own resilience, and obviously walk the talk. Nothing better than showing that there is enough technology out there, business models and other things, to show that this makes sense. The direction we go is undeniable. The question is, how fast do we go?
ABCs of leadership.
ABC.
Hakan, I'm going to have to jump to you. I mean, you're CEO of Beko. How are you guys sticking it out in times where it gets difficult? What are you thinking? What makes your leadership different?
Yeah. Well, I mean, consistency, I guess. If you start reading the news and changing and shifting your strategy, you won't go very far. Unfortunately, the direction we're going as a world is very clear. Diana shared the data. We all look at labels, dates, but actually we're falling far behind in terms of action. What that means is the consequences are very real and felt by consumers everywhere. So they are increasingly likely to choose companies who are doing the right thing over the long term. I really believe sustainability is, just so people understand what we do, we manufacture appliances, and we've been focused on sustainability for many, many years now. We've led the Dow Jones Sustainability Index for 6 years. We do this because we think it's a long-term survival strategy. If you don't decarbonize today, if you don't make your appliances more efficient today, in the future you'll be penalized for it. And Just to tell you why that's significant, appliances consume roughly a third of the power a home consumes and is responsible for 15% of emissions. As Paul said, technology exists today to cut that by 50% roughly. And it's mostly regulation dependent. But if you wait for regulations, you'll fall behind. And as a company or as a leader, what we've tried to do, and I use leader in a more loosely defined term because it's always a team, but as a leader of industry, what we've tried to do is voluntarily shift the goalpost and really track the results as opposed to targets and goals and arbitrary dates. I wear this pin 1.5 degrees because abandoning that target, I think, is absolutely insane. Going, say, okay, well, let's change it to 2, then let's change it to 2.5. The Paris Agreement was there for a reason. It set out the goal for a reason. And we're approaching a point of no return. So this is actually when leadership really counts. And I think people really are looking up to that kind of leadership, which is sustainable, long-term, consistent, and honest.
Sustainable, long-term, consistent, and honest. And I love what you said about it's leading differently. It's not the same sort of leadership that we've seen before. Kevin, at Change Now, you've been convening a number of leaders for years. And what have you seen in terms of the way that leaders need to lead nowadays?
Well, I think, coming back to your question, how do you make the leaders stay the course? I think the first thing that they should do is come here. Right, look at it. There's 10,000 companies, 2,000 leaders that are coming here, and what they see is that, the transition, that's the main stage. That is not a side play, it's the main stage. And that's the reason why we're doing what we're doing. Don't listen to what you hear in the media. Come here and you see all the people, all the amazing leaders like Hakan, like Marielle, and like Paul, that are, walking the walk. And I think that's the best way to stay the course for them, is actually to see that they're not alone in this fight. Because, you've no idea how many CEOs have told me in the past, Kevin, what can I do? I'm against the system. There's backlash, there is the regulatory backlash, there is economic turbulence, rising tensions. It's tough. But then what you need is to give them agency, to make their voices heard. You need to create a support system for them, to find all the partners that will help them achieve their vision. And that's what we're trying to do with Change Now, to make them more powerful. But the truth is, I was at Davos in January, and the truth is those leaders, they are still a very small minority of people. And there's a big minority, there's a big silent majority that we need to make to help shifting. And to do that, you don't have that many levers. The main one is regulation, but as we know, regulation right now is not helping too much. Then when you look at behavioral science, the two main levers are A, peer pressure. Look at what the other leaders are doing, their successes, their leadership. Bringing the kids, bringing the family, because the kids, when they step up, then the parents, the leaders, they also do it. So that's why we have programs for leaders and their kids on Saturday. And then, financial incentives as well, like remuneration. And that's why we have a program for board members tomorrow. We're bringing 400 board members tomorrow morning, and we're putting them in a room. I'm losing my sheet. We're putting 400 board members tomorrow from 20 countries in a room, and we're going to make them work.
So we need
and I think that's how you make them understand that they need to stay the course. Hakan said it. It's about consistency. You can't keep shifting your mindset because you're going to lose your talents. You're going to lose credibility with your customers. Like there's this company that just like a few months ago, I'm not going to name it, in consulting, that they decided to stop their gender policy, where they've lost a lot of clients. That's how it works.
We can't just make the decision and then when the wind changes with it. Actually, we need to have spaces where we remain consistent. You mentioned a lot about systems, and we talk a lot about climate goals in particular. And real progress comes when it's part of how we work, not just a general goal that we've put out there. What helps climate action become part of the system, not just a statement? Marie, can you maybe jump in on that one? What do we need to do about this system so we're not just making statements, but it's actually something that's now embedded?
Yes, thank you for this question. And I think the most important thing that we have to remember is that, in fact, climate action is not a separate, isolated goal. And in fact, what we would like to, what we always remind is everything is in fact interconnected, and that was really the idea of, of the SDGs, to say that everything is interconnected. So today, when some people or governments say, okay, well, the main thing we need to focus is growth and job creation, and not so much climate change. But no, these things are totally linked, and we see that in countries where climate change is going to happen, this will do a lot of damage in terms of growth and job creation. Some studies have shown that for every 0.1 degree of global warming, you can lose as much as 1.2% of GDP. So this is why we always connect climate strategy and social inclusion strategy. Now, this will require, as you said, systemic change and big transformation. And the key thing is, how do we make this transformation possible? And I think here there are two key notions that are important. The first one is desire. And I think one of our failures is to make this future not only accepted but also desired, and maybe what we need to do is to promote a new model and to explain why this is the future we want. And sometimes, the debate focuses more on, when we need more taxes and less of this and less of that, but we need to be positive about this. The second notion is fairness. And I think, we had this example of France of the Yellow Vest, which happened because the changes that were proposed were perceived as not being fair. Another example is the just energy transition happening in some countries, and for example in South Africa, where the government has made this the main goal of this policy, and the idea is really, okay, the country needs to be less dependent on coal-based energy, but then what will happen to the communities in Mapulanga, because they depend on coal mining and coal production. So the government is focusing with the help of international financing institutions, and how they will create new job opportunities, train people, provide social protection, so that here again the citizens need to be convinced that this will benefit them, or that the burden will be equally shared.
I love that, the fairness that sits underneath the system, not just thinking about a goal, but if we're going to bring people along with us, then everybody has to be able to benefit from it, not just one person. Hakan, I'm really interested from your perspective when it comes to having an organization in a space where we've got turbulent times, and you're trying to create a system where you don't just drop sustainability when it becomes difficult, when it's less convenient, when it's not a hot topic. How have you built sustainability into a company like Beko?
Yeah, I'll try and be really brief. Most companies try to rejig the businesses by putting sustainability around the business model. And that doesn't always work, because you're fundamentally trying to do the same thing in a different way. But if you put sustainability in the center and say, okay, as an industry, this is our role we can play. And I truly believe that if you listen to what Diane said earlier, the only way we are going to get anywhere in this battle is by reducing the energy we consume, not just changing the mix. We really have to cut down on consumption. And we have a central responsibility there. So if you make that your core mission and then put the business model around that, then you're playing a completely different game than your competitors are. And that result is self-fulfilling. If it works, and in our case it clearly has, we are now the world's second, Europe's largest appliance manufacturer. I credit our sustainability leadership in a very large part for that leadership. Then the company becomes a purposeful business. And Paul, of course, is a mentor in this. He knows far more than I do. But once people believe that what you are trying to do is real, and you are not just reporting something because regulators require you to do so, or the financial markets force you to do an ESG score. Nobody cares about the planet does not care about your ESG score. And the planet is not something you can negotiate with. So only action, meaningful action, that drives results is believable. And if you get to that believable solution, if your teams, we have 55,000 employees around the world, they believe this to be their core mission. And once you get there, then it's self-fulfilling.
Believable action. When you make sustainability the core, so the business is operating around sustainability. We've touched on it a little bit, but I want to dive in a lot deeper around financing, because it's all well and good saying we're going to do all of these things, but it normally takes a degree of money to be behind doing them. So the ambition is there, but some would argue the money doesn't follow the ambition quickly enough. We have all of these big ideas and not enough finance behind it. Paul, what do you think needs to shift structurally or politically to unlock the kind of climate finance that the urgency demands right now?
Yeah, I first want to come back to Hakan for a second. He's written a very interesting book, A Mountain to Climb. He gave me it before it was published, so I read it a long time ago. But it's really how you integrate that, and he's a wonderful example of that, how you make it the core of the business model. So to embed it, it's not different for finance, by the way, but to embed it, you need to work at 3 levels. You need to work at your own level and become the moral leader that we're needing. Today, we're short of those leaders. We really see a behavior where people overnight, because of an election, switch their opinion by 180 degrees. It's hard to understand. So how do you keep your own purpose, your own values, and be true to that? The second thing is businesses need to not only put it at the core of their business, but start to think in a regenerative way. We've overshot the planetary boundaries. If we don't start to think in repairing, restoring, like Hakan was saying, we won't get there. And the third thing, unfortunately, but very powerful, is we're so far along the line on tackling this issue that it's difficult to do alone. So we need to form these partnerships. I think the real answers to drive that system change is in partnership. Coming to the financial market, money is flowing. Don't let people tell you a different story. It's just not flowing fast enough. But we have over $2 trillion in green energy. 90% of the expansions was in green energy. The bulk of the financial market are pension funds. They want good returns for people to retire, but they also want to be sure that the world is there to retire in, and they understand that. The good thing is that so much money is now concentrated. You take the BlackRocks, the State Streets, the Japanese pension funds, the Norwegian pension funds, and the list goes on. These people have sometimes $10, $12 trillion under management. The best way for them to get returns is for societies to function. And they're actually your best allies. They're not as short-term as people may want to tell you. But you have to go to them with a value creation story, not a greenwashing story, and certainly also not a green hushing story. The second thing to unlock financing is clarity on policy. The big thing that happened in Paris, and you've heard the previous panels talk about their interpretation, but actually the big thing that happened was the countries in the world said this is where we're going. And it's that certainty of direction that is now being confused in the United States, actually, with tariff on, tariff off, tariff on, tariff off. So that certainty of direction unlocks investments. Finance works on 2 things. They work on return, obviously, and risk. So giving a clarity of direction takes care of the risk part. Where the financial world falls short is they underestimate the speed with which technology curves are making the cost curves come down. And they also underestimate the cost that we will be having in the future by not acting. This is an exponential problem, and we're trying to solve this linear. So that doesn't work. We need to bring that exponential thinking in our actions, in our understanding of technology, and actually discounting future cash flows at a different rate than currently is happening. A lot of financing will be unlocked. We are focusing on impact. We've set up about $12 billion of impact funds. They're actually outperforming the rest of the portfolios in many of these private equity companies that we work with. So it is a very investable area, and it's an area certainly you can see higher returns than in the old brown economy, not surprisingly.
Kevin, I could see you over there. Oh, go on, yeah. I'm going to let you clap. I'll let you clap. Kevin, I could see you over there profusely nodding your head. As soon as I,
it's so difficult to speak after Paul. But I mean, I agree with everything. I mean, I think it's not just a trend. It's I mean, there is capital definitely, and it's a long-term shift that's happening. Investors they understand that it's real, and it's look. It's not a challenge of a lack of capital. It's more about a challenge of sending a signal. I'm going to give you an example. Like last week, there was for the first time a global agreement on carbon price on maritime shipping emissions. That's huge because in 2028, what's going to happen is that the vessels that exceed the threshold limits will have to pay some fines, and that money will help fund innovation. Basically, what's going to happen is that this is sending a signal to investors to invest massively into innovation to make maritime sector shift. So they're going to invest in green hydrogen, in wind mobility and things like that. So that's the kind of agreements that really allow for investors as well to throw capital into a sector, because now they will have to make that move. But again, I mean, agreeing with this, the capital is there, and it's really going in the direction. We're welcoming thousands of investors at Change now. There's so many of them, so many philanthropists, so many impact investors, so many traditional investors that are investing in clean energy, in decarbonation of transport, of mobility, of real estate, smart grid, and everything. I mean, that's really the future, and this is not stopping because of some political noise that we can hear in the media right now.
Do you know what? I'm loving that it's not as bad as we thought. Maria, I can see you've got something quickly that you wanted to add on to that.
Yes, maybe building on what Paul said, because I totally agree. In fact, there is a lot of liquidity in the markets, and so the challenge is more, how do we mobilize this liquidity, and how do we direct financing flows towards the right targets? And that was really one of the main objectives of the Paris Agreement, with an article calling for parties to align financing flows with the low carbon and resilient development. And what was really innovative, and you talked about how can we stay the course, but it did provide a long-term horizon for all leaders, not only state leaders, governments, but also corporates and banks, to set their own trajectories towards this 2050 goal. And it's interesting to see that although the Paris Agreement was non-binding, in fact, so many leaders choose to set their own targets and trajectories. And for public development banks, that provided us with the basis to support country strategies towards this goal. So you were talking about systemic change, and what is interesting also for us is to hear our clients, because a few years ago, and now every other year, we do a client satisfaction survey. And what we noticed was that our client was asking us to go beyond supporting their projects or investments, but really support their strategies of transformation. And so what we're doing more and more is, in fact, to provide finance that supports actors rather than investments, and with triggers based on results. And another important thing for public development banks to do is mobilize also this finance that exists in large numbers. And so this is done through innovative financing instruments, but also through working on policies and environments, because you said, okay, what drives private investments is returns, and it's also certainty and risk. And I think what we can do is also make sure that business environments and regulations is right. An important thing that did happen in Europe over the last few years, someone mentioned, well, regulation can do everything, of course, but one very important thing that happened in Europe over the last few years is regulation requiring financial institutions to assess climate risk, meaning that climate change is becoming a systemic risk for regulatory institutions. So now every financial institution in Europe has to measure physical and transition risk, and I think that's a big systemic change.
Fantastic. Do you know what? We can only really scratch the surface of this dialogue in the time that we've got, and I really wish that we could go deeper. I'm gonna cheekily end with one last question, and that's gonna give you, you've got like a sentence to answer it in. If there was one mindset or habit or narrative that we need to let go of to be more effective in the next decade, just one, and you've got a sentence each before somebody comes and drags me off this stage. Hakan, I'm going to let you go first.
We have to really stop talking about what may happen, what could happen, and really focus on the data. What is happening now, and act accordingly.
Focus on the data and act accordingly. Marie-Hélène?
I think what we need to do is fight fatalism, and we need to be convinced that change is possible, that we're capable to trigger change.
We're capable of triggering change. Paul?
Yeah, I actually agree. There's a feeling of powerless, of fear out there, and these are reactions, and that's not a good situation to be in. It doesn't lead to anything. So you have to muster that individual and collective courage, which is action. So we can choose what side we want to be. And if you want to be on the side of justice, in side of doing what is right for future generations, etc., it has to lead to courage. It's individuals ultimately that make the difference.
We've got to have courage because it's individuals that make the difference. And finally, Kevin?
I would say ego-driven leadership. China is the fourth company I've built, and I've learned over time that leadership shouldn't be about control. In too many places, leadership means giving orders, taking the decisions, taking charge. But in reality, what people follow is not instructions. They follow intent. So leaders should give intent and not instructions. Why? Because that's when you invite your team to think, to question, and to take ownership. And when people feel that they are trusted, that's when they feel that their decisions matter. And that's when they don't just follow you, they grow. And what we need right now, it's a world where it's not more leaders that attract followers, it's actually leaders that create more leaders. And I really think that right now, what we need, it's not about taking more space, it's about transmitting. So that's what I would say about what we need right now.
It's the intent behind the leaders. Thank you all so much for your time. And my name is Lavalda Vincenzi. Thank you so much. I'll see you in the next session. Take care.